The sands of time remember everything, even what empires tried to erase. In the heat-hazed horizon where the Nile touches the breath of the desert, destiny did not whisper, it roared. A queen born not merely of royal blood, but of celestial arrogance, and a general forged not only in war, but in ambition sharper than any sword. Cleopatra and Julius Caesar were not merely lovers. They were omens wrapped in silk and steel. Their meeting was no accident of history, no simple intersection of power and seduction. It was the clash of myth and will, the fusion of Rome's iron law with Egypt's eternal mystery. He came to her not as a man, but as a world unto himself. Conqueror, tactician, philosopher, dictator. She greeted him not as a woman, but as a living deity in the flesh, embodiment of Isis, flame of Egypt, enigma of the old world. And in that moment, the course of history shifted like the Nile in flood. Rome had conquered nations, but it had never met a mind like hers. She did not use armies, she used eternity. Her voice was the echo of ancient temples, her gaze the weight of 10,000 pharaohs watching through the veil. Caesar, who crossed the Rubicon with unflinching resolve, who silenced the Senate with mere presence, found in her something he could not outmaneuver, the deep, liquid intelligence of a queen raised not just to rule, but to command symbols, to shape narratives, to summon reverence with a glance. She saw in him more than a military machine. She saw the divine spark in his hunger, and he, who had subdued Gaul and outplayed Pompey, stood before her like a pupil before a priestess of fate. Their union was not a courtship. It was an alchemical ritual, a transmutation of power into legacy. They spoke in languages unspoken, their gestures more potent than treaties. When she welcomed him rolled inside a carpet, it was not seduction, it was strategy wrapped in myth. She knew symbols were stronger than swords, and stories lasted longer than statues. Caesar did not fall in love. He recognized a mirror of his own imperial soul. Together, they did not just embrace, they rewrote the meaning of empire. But love born in palaces is never simple. Every glance they shared was watched by marble eyes of gods. Every whisper echoed in shadowed corridors where daggers were whetted by ambition. The Senate in Rome, drunk on its own illusion of democracy, feared her not because she was foreign, but because she was inevitable. Her presence in Caesar's life was a prophecy with golden earrings and serpent wisdom, and prophecies are always dangerous. They called her witch, manipulator, enchantress, but only because they lacked the courage to name her true queen, strategist, embodiment of the future where power wore perfume and ruled through allure. She bore him a son, Caesarion, not just a child, but a living claim to legacy, a threat wrapped in innocence, a Rome that could wear both crown and coal. The child was not just flesh. He was a fracture in Roman certainty. In the Senate halls, where envy sits heavier than marble, they whispered of betrayal. Caesar, the god-slayer, now walked with a goddess. His plans smelled of incense and lotus, not blood and dust. The knives were drawn not out of hatred, but fear. Fear that Rome was becoming something older, something sacred, something it could no longer control. The Ides of March did not just mark the end of a man. They marked the end of illusion. Caesar fell not in a war, but in a ritual sacrifice offered by men too small to understand the tide they tried to stop. Cleopatra felt the dagger in her womb, in the silence that followed the news. But queens do not mourn like widows. They reforge themselves. She returned to Egypt with her son, and with fire in her breath. She would not crawl to Rome. She would raise Egypt to a myth so radiant that even Caesar's murderers would tremble in their sleep. She ruled not with armies, but with divinity. Her throne was flanked not by generals, but by symbols: papyrus, sun disk, the cobra that spits death upon all who forget reverence. And in the echoes of palace halls, the ghost of Caesar lingered, not as a memory, but as a vow. The world would remember their story not as gossip, but as scripture. Together they had carved their romance into the bones of time, written not with ink, but with ambition, blood, gold, and myth. And still, the world turns, pretending they were just people. But the soul knows better. The soul remembers what history tries to soften. Their love was not tender, it was tectonic. Their touch was not sweet, it was seismic. And in every crown worn after, in every empire that rose pretending to be eternal, their shadow walks, whispering, "Remember the queen, remember the general, remember that empires are not built on laws or swords. They are built on the alchemy of vision and desire. And the world, no matter how modern it becomes, will always be ruled by stories such as theirs. History does not forget those who burned brighter than nations, and in the ashes of fallen empires, their names rise like smoke in sacred rituals. After the death of Caesar, Cleopatra stood not as a grieving lover, but as the final priestess of a dying age, a living monument of everything the ancient world still dared to hope for. Her beauty was legendary, but legends lie unless they are backed by something deeper: intellect, command, and an understanding of human nature so profound it borders on sorcery. She knew that power is never just in the armies or in the treasury. It lives in perception, in myth, in the way a ruler makes people believe. And belief is the currency of eternity. Caesar had believed in her, and for a time, Rome bowed to the Nile. But now, Rome was fractured, its soul splintered by ambition and bloodlust. Into this chaos walked another force of nature: Mark Antony, the lion of Rome, the thunder behind Caesar's lightning. He came not to mourn Caesar, but to finish what had begun, to stabilize the Republic, to harness the storm Caesar had unleashed. Yet when he looked into Cleopatra's eyes, he did not see a widow. He saw prophecy reborn. She did not seduce him, she summoned him. Their connection was not romance, it was cosmic resonance, the pull of two ancient spirits trapped in mortal flesh. With Antony, she saw not Caesar's echo, but his evolution, raw, impassioned, vulnerable in ways Caesar never allowed himself to be. With Cleopatra, Antony saw not a queen, but a sanctuary, a place where power did not demand pretense, where ambition was not shameful but divine. Together they were not merely lovers, they were a living rebellion against the dying world. They formed a new center of gravity, a new Rome along the Nile, one rooted not in austerity but in ceremony, in abundance, in the ancient rites of kings and gods. The east shimmered with gold and incense, and the west watched with sharpened steel. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, saw not love but heresy. In his eyes, Cleopatra had bewitched two of Rome's greatest sons, and was now corrupting the legacy of Caesar himself. But the truth was far more dangerous. Cleopatra had not corrupted Rome, she had exposed it. She revealed the hollowness of Roman austerity, the fear beneath the togas, the envy masked as virtue. Her union with Antony was not decadence, it was defiance. And so, Octavian declared war not just on Egypt, but on a vision of the world where women could rule, where East and West could merge not through conquest, but through communion. Antony and Cleopatra stood as avatars of this forbidden dream. Their ships glimmered on the sea, adorned with purple sails, golden oars, and drums that echoed like war chants from another dimension. But dreams, however divine, are mortal in the hands of men who fear change. At Actium, the sea turned into a graveyard, and with every sinking ship, the dream began to drown. Antony, once the storm of Rome, faltered, not because he was weak, but because love had made him real. He was no longer armor, he was flesh. Cleopatra, watching the tides turn, felt the weight of 10,000 ancestors pressing against her chest. Egypt, the cradle of civilization, now stood on the edge of myth and oblivion. When Antony fell on his sword, dying not as a soldier but as a lover, bleeding in the arms of a queen whose name the gods themselves had once whispered, time itself wept. But Cleopatra was not done. She adorned herself in royal garb, summoned her serpents, and stepped into legend. Her death was not surrender, it was authorship. She refused to be paraded through Rome like a trophy. She would not let Octavian write her ending. And so, with asp and silence, she became immortal. They say she died, but the truth is, she transformed. In every story told thereafter, in every queen who defied fate, in every whisper of power wrapped in mystery, her name lives. Cleopatra was not just a queen. She was an idea too powerful for her own era. And Caesar? He was not just a general. He was the bridge between republic and empire, between logic and legacy. Together, they were more than history. They were prophecy. They remind us that love is not weakness. It is revelation. That power is not cruelty. It is clarity. That to rule is not merely to control, but to awaken. The world remembers wars and victories, but the soul remembers stories. And their story, written in blood and gold, is the kind that outlives marble and outshines thrones. When the dust of empire settles and only silence remains, their names still echo in the winds, calling to those who dare to love dangerously, rule wisely, and burn so brightly the stars themselves take notice. The queen and the general were not simply figures of antiquity. They were manifestations of archetypes buried deep in the collective psyche of humanity. Incarnations of power entwined with longing, wisdom dressed in human skin. Their story does not fade with the passing of centuries because it was never truly about Rome or Egypt. It was about the eternal dance between vision and resistance, between creation and destruction, between man and myth. In every age, these roles are played again, under different names, wearing different crowns, but always echoing the same fundamental question: can love survive power? Can greatness endure intimacy? Can two souls destined for legend walk the earth without tearing it apart? Cleopatra answered with her silence, her venomous kiss, her choice to die as a goddess rather than live as a prisoner. Caesar answered with his defiance, his audacity to claim it all, to carve his name into the bones of time, even if it meant betrayal and blood. Their son, Caesarion, the child of East and West, was the embodiment of that fragile hope, that maybe, just maybe, two worlds could coexist, not through war, but through union. But hope, in the hands of small men, becomes a threat. Octavian, the cold architect of empire, saw the child not as a legacy, but as a rival. He had no space in his Rome for prophecy, for magic, for the possibility that power could wear eyeliner and speak in riddles. And so the child king was murdered, like a dream suffocated in its cradle, and the world was reshaped to fit Octavian's narrow vision. He called himself Augustus, the Exalted One, and ruled an empire washed clean of myth, gilded in marble, sterile in law. But he could not erase the shadow that Cleopatra and Caesar cast. For in secret, people still whispered of the queen with eyes like sacred ink, and the general who turned rivers into roads. Artists painted their story into hidden corners, poets sang their names in forbidden verses, and mystics traced their journey in the stars. Because every soul longs to believe that love can defy destiny, that greatness can be born not only in conquest, but in connection. Their tale became more than history. It became a mirror, and those who looked into it saw reflections of their own struggles, the battle between duty and desire, between control and surrender, between survival and transcendence. Cleopatra was not merely a ruler. She was a lesson, written in the language of gods, that to wield true power is to know when to let go. Caesar was not merely a conqueror. He was a warning, etched in ambition, that even the most brilliant minds can fall to the simplest blade. Yet both of them, in their union, birthed something that even death could not consume. A story that continues to breathe in the collective imagination of humanity. For every time a woman speaks truth to power and wraps wisdom in beauty, Cleopatra lives again. Every time a man sees the world not just as it is, but as it could be, and dares to act, Caesar walks again. They are not dead. They are mythologically alive, in every flame that refuses to be extinguished, in every soul that refuses to kneel, in every heart that burns brighter than fear. The queen and the general rise, not as ghosts, but as guides, not as relics, but as reminders. That power is not meant to corrupt, but to illuminate. That love is not meant to weaken, but to awaken. That destiny is not written in stone, but in blood and gold, and the fire of those who dare. And so, when you hear their names, do not think of ruins or sarcophagi. Think of possibility. Think of the sacred war between the heart and the world. Think of the way a woman once ruled an empire with a glance, and a man once changed history with a choice. They were not perfect. They were not pure, but they were real in a way that legend often forgets to be. They remind us that the greatest stories are not about winning. They are about becoming. Becoming more than the roles we are given. Becoming the storm, the temple, the throne. Becoming eternal not through survival, but through meaning. That is what Cleopatra and Caesar became. Not rulers of nations, but rulers of narrative. And in a world still ruled by illusion, that may be the greatest power of all. But what truly makes their legacy unshakable is not the palaces or pyramids, not the battles or the scrolls, but the fact that they embraced their fate with eyes wide open. They knew the cost of their choices. They knew the empire they dreamed could not be built in a world that feared balance, that feared love, that feared a woman with knowledge and a man with vulnerability. Still, they did not retreat. They did not apologize. They burned brighter. Their lives became a question written in fire. What if the world had chosen union over domination, mystery over monotony, soul over system? What if East and West had not fought but fused, not with chains but with ceremony, not with soldiers but with stories? That was the kingdom they tried to birth, not a place but a possibility, and possibility terrifies those who worship certainty. That is why Octavian did not simply want victory. He wanted erasure. He needed the world to forget the queen and the general, or at least to remember them wrong. He painted Cleopatra as a temptress, Caesar as a tyrant, and their love as a weakness that ruined empires. But propaganda cannot outlast passion, and even as his empire grew, the cracks formed in its soul. For in quiet moments, when the marble halls were silent and the oil lamps flickered like ghosts, even the sons of Rome dreamed of Alexandria, the city where knowledge kissed the sea and passion walked in gold. Cleopatra's palace may have crumbled, but her legend remained untouched. For legends do not live in stone, they live in longing, and Caesar's ashes may have been scattered, but his shadow still moved behind every ruler who dared to reshape the world. Their myth persisted not because it was convenient, but because it was true. Not true in the way historians demand, but in the way the soul recognizes. The kind of truth that doesn't need evidence, only resonance. And so, across centuries and civilizations, artists return to them like pilgrims to a shrine. Shakespeare heard their whispers and wrote their tragedy in verse. Painters dipped brushes in wine and blood to recreate her gaze, his ambition. Philosophers pondered what their union meant for fate and freedom. Occultists saw in them divine archetypes, the goddess and the warrior, the serpent and the eagle. And in every age, someone asked the same question. What if they had won? What if their dream had lived? What if history had bent just once in favor of beauty and wisdom over brute control? That question never dies. It echoes in every revolution, in every forbidden romance, in every moment when someone chooses truth over safety. Cleopatra and Caesar are not just names. They are catalysts. When you say their names, you are invoking something ancient and dangerous and divine. You are summoning the moment when love challenged empire, when the feminine and the masculine stood as equals, when the future trembled at the foot of a dream. And that is why they matter. Not because they were flawless, but because they were fearless, because they looked into the eyes of history and said, "We will not be written by you. We will write ourselves. We will not be statues to be admired. We will be storms to be remembered." And so they became more than mortal, not through immortality of flesh, but of fire. Their story is not a lesson. It is a spell, one that awakens the wild, the romantic, the visionary in us all, one that dares us to live boldly, to lead with soul, to love without armor. And when the world calls that foolish, remember, it called them foolish too. Then it spent 2,000 years trying to forget them, and failed. And so their legacy moves not in straight lines, but in spirals, not bound by timelines, but resurrected by memory, by longing, by the hunger for stories that feel more like mirrors than monuments. For in the tale of Cleopatra and Caesar, we do not merely see the past, we see ourselves. We see the part of us that dares to dream with reckless devotion, the part that chooses love in a world that rewards calculation, the part that reaches for destiny knowing it might burn. They were not perfect rulers or perfect lovers, but they were perfectly human in their defiance of the roles the world tried to force upon them. Cleopatra was never content to be a pawn in a man's game. She mastered the board, rewrote the rules, and crowned herself sovereign in every sense. She was more than beauty. She was intellect sculpted into allure, strategy wrapped in silk, a queen not of submission but of sovereign seduction. Caesar was more than ambition. He was vision incarnate, a man who saw not only what Rome was, but what it could become, who traded comfort for chaos, safety for sovereignty, legacy for lightning. And in their meeting, the world cracked open just long enough to glimpse something divine. That is why their story survives, why it resists decay, why it ignites generation after generation, because they remind us that greatness is not found in playing safe. It is found in embracing the storm. that love is not the opposite of power, but its refinement, that to rule with soul is the most dangerous and sacred act of all. And though the world may pretend to prefer the orderly, the explainable, the sanitized, our hearts still beat faster for the wild, the impossible, the tragic, and true. We are drawn not to those who survive history, but to those who shape it, bend it, burn in it. And Cleopatra and Caesar did not survive. They transcended. Their bodies fell, but their myth grew. Their enemies ruled for decades. Their names ruled for centuries. For in the end, no monument stands taller than a story whose flame refuses to die. Their romance was not about happy endings. It was about eternal beginnings. Each time someone dares to choose love over fear, Cleopatra lives. Each time someone sees what is and still believes in what could be, Caesar returns. They are not buried. They are blooming in art, in rebellion, in every heart that beats against the rhythm of empire. And now, in your listening, you too carry their fire. You too become part of the myth, not as a spectator, but as a spark, a reminder that what is written in blood and gold cannot be erased. That true power is not control, but connection, not domination, but destiny. And the greatest destiny is not to rule others, but to awaken them. That is the final gift of the queen and the general. Not a warning, not a lesson, but a torch. Take it. Burn your path into the dark. Love like empires depend on it. Dream like the stars are watching. And remember that between the lines of every history, behind the silence of every empire, beneath the dust of every tomb, there are two names still burning. Caesar, Cleopatra, fire and silk, thunder and serpent, blood and gold, and now you.